Imagine this. A simple mistake at the airport spirals into a showdown with none other than Clint Eastwood. From a moment of tension to a lesson in humility, you won't believe how this interaction unfolds. What happens when a young employee accidentally denies Clint Eastwood first-class access? Well, let's just say it's more than just a mistake. It's a story you'll remember. Stick around to see how this moment turns into a lesson learned and why Clint's response will stay with you long after the video ends. Before we dive into this unforgettable story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And hey, if you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. It was just another hectic morning at the airport, the kind where travelers rushed from gate to gate, the air buzzing with anticipation and frustration. Clint Eastwood, a man used to commanding attention, walked into the terminal with the casual confidence of someone who had traveled the world. His worn leather jacket, a testament to years of experience, flapped gently behind him as he moved. He wasn't looking for a crowd, but it followed him all the same. Heads turned, whispers fluttered, and a few excited gasps could be heard as people recognized him. After all, Clint Eastwood wasn't just another passenger, he was a living legend, the face of the toughest characters in Hollywood. He made his way through the sea of people, his gait steady, never rushing, never concerned with the chaos around him. For Clint, this was just another day. But for the people around him, it was anything but ordinary. A teenager tried to sneak a picture, but Clint's sharp eyes caught him. With a half smile, Clint simply nodded, the moment passing without fuss. No drama, just a glance that said it all. Classic Eastwood. At the check-in counter, Sarah, a young employee in her early 20s, was buried in the usual airport madness. Her shift had just begun and already the stress was taking its toll. Bags piled high on the counter, endless boarding passes were being processed, and every other person seemed to have a question or complaint. The humdrum of customer service was nothing new, but today Sarah felt like it was a little heavier. She was doing her best to keep up, her eyes darting from one task to the next, mentally ticking off checklists, trying to stay ahead of the demands. She could hear the chatter of passengers and see the clock ticking, but she was too focused on the task at hand to pay attention to anything else. The steady flow of passengers felt like an unrelenting tide. The weight of her responsibilities seemed to add more pressure than usual. She wasn't thinking about what, or who, was coming next. That is, until the unmistakable presence of Clint Eastwood reached her counter. Clint wasn't one for making a scene, he didn't need to. But the aura around him was undeniable. When he approached the counter, Sarah was so absorbed in her work that she didn't immediately register who he was. She gave a quick, polite smile, ready to handle the next customer in line. "Ticket, please," she said in a professional, if distracted tone, her hands moving efficiently as she prepared to check him in. But as Clint handed over his boarding pass, Sarah's eyes flicked to his face for just a moment. It was brief, just a glance, but it was enough. The recognition hit her like a freight train. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood. The man who had defined tough guy cinema for decades. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat for the briefest second before she caught herself and tried to refocus. But it was too late. Clint Eastwood was standing at her counter, and she was already in the middle of her routine, unprepared for the encounter. The hum of the airport around them seemed to fade for a moment as the weight of the situation finally settled on Sarah. But she couldn't afford to falter now. Her professionalism kicked in and she forced a smile, trying to seem unfazed. She was a seasoned employee after all. She couldn't let herself be starstruck. Clint waited, his gaze steady and unflinching, the quiet presence of a man used to being in control. And Sarah? She had no idea just how much this simple transaction was about to spiral out of control. Clint Eastwood approached Sarah's counter, his footsteps steady and deliberate. The sound of his boots on the tile floor seemed to echo just a little louder than everyone else's. Sarah, still focused on her task, looked up, barely registering the significance of the man before her. She offered a polite but automatic greeting, her tone professional and devoid of any hint of recognition. "Ticket, please," Sarah said, her hands already in motion as she took the boarding pass from Clint, scanning it swiftly into the system. Her smile was practiced routine. She was already thinking ahead to the next task. Boarding passes, luggage waiting times. This was just another customer. She didn't even think twice as she hit the button to retrieve the reservation. But then the screen flickered for a moment, and the message that popped up caught her attention. It was supposed to be just another routine check. But this wasn't routine. Sarah's fingers froze for a split second as her eyes scanned the text that had appeared. Her stomach dropped. "I'm sorry, Mr. Eastwood," she said, glancing up at him, her voice still polite, but now faltering slightly. "There's been a mix-up with your reservation. It seems you can't board first class." Clint's expression didn't change at first. He simply stood there waiting. But something in the air shifted. There was an immediate tension that Sarah couldn't quite place, something that felt out of sync with the usual flow of airport interactions. Clint's unblinking stare was just a little too sharp, a little too quiet. Her words, though still polite, felt jarring in the silence between them. The crowd around them seemed to shrink as the message settled in the air. "The system shows your first-class seat is unavailable," she continued, trying to sound as professional as possible. "There's been an error, Mr. Eastwood, and I'm afraid you'll need to take a different seat." Clint's eyebrows furrowed ever so slightly, a twitch of confusion and surprise crossing his face. His calm, controlled demeanor, something that had made him an icon of stoic coolness, suddenly seemed to carry a heavy weight. He wasn't angry, but there was something about him in this moment that made Sarah's stomach tighten. The smoothness of the encounter she had expected quickly evaporated. His voice, low and steady, cut through the air. "You're telling me I can't board first class?" His words weren't raised or aggressive, but there was an edge to them now, a quiet but unmistakable power behind his calm delivery. Sarah swallowed, the knot in her throat growing tighter. She tried to stay on task, the words spilling out faster than she intended. It's just a system issue, Mr. Eastwood," she stammered, trying to keep her voice even. "I don't have any control over that. I can offer you a different seat, but first class is unavailable." The passengers in line behind Clint started to shift, sensing the strange shift in energy. Sarah was oblivious to what she had just stepped into, a situation that would escalate far beyond her control. She continued explaining, her words blurring together as she tried to find a solution that would placate the man standing before her, all the while unaware of who she was truly dealing with. But Clint didn't seem in any rush to accept her explanation. His gaze didn't break. The tension between them thickened, each second stretching longer, the quiet weight of the moment growing heavier. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. But there was something in his eyes, something piercing that made Sarah's confidence waver. "I didn't book a different seat," Clint finally spoke again, his tone almost too calm. "I booked first class. You're telling me I'm not allowed to sit there?" Sarah's fingers fumbled as she tried to explain further. "There's a system glitch," she repeated, though she could tell by the way Clint's gaze never shifted that her words were falling on deaf ears. The weight of her mistake, the weight of her oversight, was starting to press in on her, and she felt it, the pressure to fix this and fast. But she couldn't. Not yet. The quiet hum of the airport, the noise of announcements and distant conversations, felt miles away. All that existed now was Clint Eastwood, standing before her, and the cold, impersonal system that had thrown a wrench in everything. And Sarah? She was in way over her head. The moment Sarah's words landed, she could feel the room shift. She had hoped that by following the protocol, by sticking to the rules, everything would be fine. But now it was clear she was stepping into something far beyond her control. "I don't care who you are," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly as she tried to assert some authority. She had done everything right, or so she thought. "These are the rules. First class is unavailable." Clint didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed to lean in just a little, ever so slightly, closing the gap between them. His eyes locked onto hers, intense and unblinking, like a predator slowly circling its prey. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that could cut through steel. "Are you telling me," Clint paused, his gaze never wavering, "I can't board first class? Do you even know who I am?" The words landed like a punch. They weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. But they were heavy, and they made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Her stomach flipped, and for the first time she realized just how badly this could go. This wasn't just any passenger standing before her. This was Clint Eastwood. The man who had built a career on being untouchable, legendary, a symbol of strength and authority. And she had just told him he couldn't board first class. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, as if the people around them were suddenly aware that something was unfolding right in front of them. They weren't just watching a routine check-in, they were witnessing a confrontation that was turning into something much bigger. Sarah froze, the words escaping her as her mind scrambled to connect the dots. What had she done? What had she triggered? She had followed the rules, hadn't she? She had followed the system. But now, with Clint Eastwood staring her down, those rules felt so small, so insignificant. I'm just doing my job," she stammered, her face flushed with embarrassment. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't anticipated this kind of pushback, and certainly not from someone of Clint's stature. Her voice quivered as she tried to hold on to some semblance of authority. "There's nothing I can do." But Clint wasn't done yet. He didn't seem interested in the excuses, in the rules, or the protocol. He was fixated on the error, on the injustice of the situation. His eyes were steely, unyielding, like a man who had faced far greater battles than this one, and never lost. "Well, your job just made a big mistake." Clint's voice was calm, but it sliced through the air with the kind of cold precision that only Clint Eastwood could deliver. His words weren't a threat, they were a statement of fact. The tension between them was palpable. Sarah, still standing behind the counter, now fully aware that this was not a simple customer interaction. The crowd around them was no longer just a passive audience. Eyes were locked on the two of them, whispers rippling through the air. Some people were trying to sneak a peek, some were whispering to their companions, and others were just frozen, watching the drama unfold. The small, everyday conflict between customer and employee had suddenly turned into something far more significant. Clint wasn't just any celebrity. He wasn't a normal passenger. He was Clint Eastwood, and now he was making his point loud and clear. The tension was building. Everyone felt it, even those who hadn't seen his movies. It wasn't about a flight anymore. It was about respect, about authority, about the kind of power Clint Eastwood carried simply by standing there. "I'm sorry," Sarah mumbled, but it was barely audible against the growing noise around them. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and the pressure was building. She wasn't used to this kind of scrutiny, and now it felt like the walls were closing in. She was just trying to do her job, but somewhere along the way she had crossed a line she hadn't realized existed. Clint didn't break his stare, his posture rigid and unyielding. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after being treated like this. The crowd, sensing the shift, leaned in closer, every eye on Clint as if waiting for him to make the next move. And Clint? He wasn't about to let this go. He didn't need first class, but damn it, he wasn't going to let anyone, especially someone like Sarah, treat him as though he didn't matter. The escalating tension between Clint and Sarah had drawn the attention of the surrounding passengers, and the murmurs were now unmistakable. Sarah was on the verge of collapse under the weight of it all. Just as she was about to offer another apologetic stammer, a voice broke through the noise. A manager, having heard the commotion, swiftly approached the counter. His face was a mix of concern and confusion, his eyes darting between Sarah and Clint. He could feel the shift in the air as soon as he laid eyes on the scene. The atmosphere was thick, and it was clear this was no ordinary customer service issue. The manager's gaze flickered to the screen, then back to Clint. Recognition flashed in his eyes as his mind put the pieces together. He didn't need to ask twice. "Wait, do you know who this is?" the manager asked Sarah, his voice sharp with realization. He wasn't angry at her, but it was obvious she'd just made a mistake of monumental proportions. In that instant, it was as if a light bulb went off in Sarah's head. Her pulse raced and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Her face drained of color as she locked eyes with Clint Eastwood, standing right in front of her. She had no words. She had no idea how she could have missed it. How could she have been so careless? "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The gravity of the moment hit her like a freight train. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm so sorry." The apology tumbled out of her mouth in a rushed, panicked string of words. "I didn't realize it was you. Please forgive me. This is a mistake." Her heart raced as she fumbled for some kind of redemption, her face turning a deep shade of red as she realized how badly she had handled the situation. The crowd around them had fallen into a hushed silence, sensing the shift from confrontation to something else entirely. All the tension, the frustration, the anger in Clint's eyes was suddenly diffused, and it was replaced with something Sarah could never have predicted: embarrassment, hers, not his. The manager, now fully aware of the misstep, quickly stepped in, his voice firm but apologetic as he addressed Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, I'm terribly sorry for this confusion. Please allow me to make this right." He turned to Sarah, his tone taking on a note of urgency. "I'll personally handle this from here on out. We'll upgrade you immediately, sir, and ensure your experience is as smooth as possible. You have my word." The manager was all professionalism now, a stark contrast to Sarah's rattled demeanor. He gestured for Clint to follow him toward the VIP area, clearly desperate to rectify the situation as quickly as possible. His eyes remained focused on Clint, who had yet to speak a word, his silent presence still commanding the space around him. Sarah, now completely mortified, stood frozen behind the counter, feeling like the weight of the world had just landed on her shoulders. The heat in her face was unbearable as she realized the true scale of her mistake. "I'm so sorry," she repeated in her head, but the words didn't seem to carry any weight. How could she apologize for something this big? I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she stammered, barely finding her voice. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Eastwood. I didn't know. I didn't recognize you." Her words trailed off as she realized how ridiculous she sounded. Clint's eyes flicked briefly toward Sarah, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry anymore, but the gravity of the situation still hung in the air. There was no need for further words. The apology had been made, the mistake acknowledged, and the damage was done. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. "It's all right," he said in a low voice, his words cool but carrying a hint of finality. "Just make sure it doesn't happen again." And with that, he turned, following the manager toward the VIP area, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart still pounding in her chest, her face still flushed with embarrassment. The crowd slowly dispersed, muttering among themselves about the scene they had just witnessed. As Clint walked away, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her legs feeling like jelly. The adrenaline had drained from her body, leaving behind a deep sense of humiliation. She would never forget this moment. It would be the one she'd tell her friends about, the one she'd think about late at night when the embarrassment crept back into her mind. But for Clint Eastwood, this was just another day in the life of a legend. Another story to add to his collection of unforgettable moments. Clint stood there for what felt like an eternity, his presence unwavering as the silence between him and Sarah stretched on. The weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air, and everyone around them could feel it. The crowd, which had once been just a background hum, now stood still, waiting, anticipating, watching to see how this moment would unfold. Sarah felt her heart pounding in her chest. She had apologized, she had made amends in the best way she knew how, but it still felt like the damage had been done. Her hands were clammy, her face still flushed with the sting of her mistake. The manager had stepped in, but Clint's gaze still lingered on her, making her feel as though she was under a spotlight. She had done everything she could, and yet, the gravity of the situation made her feel small. The crowd was waiting. She could hear the murmurs, the soft gasps of those around her, as they wondered how Clint Eastwood, the man who had spent decades playing tough, untouchable characters, would react. Clint didn't rush to speak. He simply stood there, calm, unflinching. His eyes, which had held an intensity from the moment he stepped up to the counter, softened just slightly. His gaze lingered for a moment longer, and it was clear he wasn't looking for an apology anymore. He wasn't angry. He was just there, a quiet force of nature. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Clint broke the silence. "It's all right, kid," he said, his voice low and measured. His words carried a certain weight, as if he had seen it all before. "Happens to the best of us." His tone was calm but firm, and there was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, no resentment. Just the quiet wisdom of a man who had been through his fair share of mistakes and lessons. The words, simple as they were, cut through the tension like a knife. They were the kind of words that could defuse the most explosive situations, and they did just that. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, seemed to exhale in unison. The tension that had built up between Clint and Sarah dissipated, and the atmosphere lightened. The murmurs from the onlookers softened as people relaxed, realizing that the conflict had been resolved. Some even exchanged smiles, grateful for the unexpected kindness in Clint's response. Sarah blinked, processing his words. She had expected something more, something harsher maybe, but what she got was a simple acknowledgement, a release of the tension she had created. She felt a mixture of relief and humiliation. Relief that Clint had let her off the hook, but humiliation that she had needed to be let off the hook at all. She was grateful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been tested, and she had failed, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. She looked at Clint, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to proceed after the storm had passed. She felt her embarrassment still hanging in the air, but she also felt a sense of gratitude. He didn't have to be this kind, she thought. He could have made this a much bigger scene. But Clint had moved on. He wasn't dwelling on it. He wasn't looking to make her feel small. With that simple statement, he had done exactly what he needed to do, de-escalate the situation and move on. No fuss. No drama. Clint gave her a brief, almost imperceptible nod before turning to follow the manager. His demeanor, while still imposing, had softened. He had made his point. He had taken control of the situation without needing to raise his voice, and now he was walking away, leaving behind a sense of calm in the wake of the storm. Sarah stood there watching him go, her chest still tight with emotion. The tension had broken, but it wasn't easy. She had been given a second chance, but the sting of her mistake still lingered. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the lesson she'd learned that day: don't judge a passenger by their booking. And, more importantly, respect matters more than rules. As Clint disappeared into the crowd, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It wasn't over yet, not entirely. She still had to face the manager and her colleagues, but the hardest part was behind her. Clint Eastwood had let her off the hook, and for that she would always be grateful. But next time? She wouldn't make the same mistake. The manager was on high alert now, moving quickly to make things right. He turned to Clint with a renewed sense of urgency, offering a sincere apology and a solution to the problem that had unfolded. "Mr. Eastwood, I'll personally ensure you are upgraded to the best seat available," the manager said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the mistake. "We'll make sure this experience is flawless from this moment on. VIP treatment, priority service, anything you need, it's all yours." Clint, ever the picture of calm, didn't seem to be in a hurry. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, allowing the manager to flounder slightly under the weight of his own mistake. Clint's stillness wasn't threatening, it was just quiet. A powerful silence that made Sarah feel as though the room was holding its breath. It was as if Clint wanted to make sure everyone understood the gravity of the situation before it was completely resolved. Sarah watched, still feeling the residual sting of her mistake, her hands twisting nervously behind the counter. She wasn't sure whether to apologize again or just let the moment pass. But then, as Clint turned to walk away, he offered one last piece of advice, something that caught Sarah completely off guard. "If you don't mind," Clint said, his voice low but laced with a hint of humor. A small smirk, barely noticeable, played at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a taunt, but it carried an unmistakable sense of quiet authority. "Make sure the rest of the passengers are treated better than I was." It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a demand. It was a remark, one that left Sarah feeling both relieved and humiliated at the same time. Clint had just let her off the hook, and yet, the weight of his words was still hanging in the air. He wasn't angry. He wasn't seeking revenge. But he wanted her to learn. He wanted her to remember. With that, Clint gave a slight nod, the smirk lingering on his face for just a moment longer before he turned and walked toward the gate. His presence, though still imposing, seemed to fade into the crowd as he moved with purpose. He had made his point. He had corrected the mistake without fanfare, and now it was over. But for Sarah, it wasn't over. Not yet. As Clint disappeared into the terminal, the reality of the situation started to settle in. She had made a huge mistake in front of a crowd, in front of a living legend. But Clint Eastwood had handled it with grace, leaving her with a lesson that would stick with her for a long time. She couldn't ignore the fact that his last remark wasn't just about the passengers he was leaving behind. It was about her. It was about her treatment of him and the reminder to do better. The manager turned back to Sarah, his face a little less tense but still carrying the seriousness of the situation. "Well, that's one for the books," he said with a wry smile. "Let's make sure nothing like this happens again, all right?" Sarah nodded, still processing the exchange. She wasn't sure whether to feel grateful to Clint or ashamed of herself, but one thing was certain. This was a moment she would never forget. The lesson was clear. Respect for everyone, no matter who they are, is essential. She just hoped she wouldn't forget it next time. As the airport returned to its usual hustle and bustle, Sarah couldn't shake the lingering impact of Clint's words. The crowd had scattered, the excitement fading, but for Sarah, the weight of the encounter would stay with her for a while. She would do better. She had to. As Clint Eastwood walked down the jet bridge, disappearing into the calm behind the curtains of the terminal, Sarah stood frozen at the counter. The rush of activity around her seemed to move in slow motion, the weight of the past few minutes still pressing heavily on her chest. Her face burned with embarrassment, the heat radiating from her cheeks like a warning sign to the world around her. She could still hear Clint's voice in her head, that calm yet firm tone of a man who had seen it all, his words echoing in the air, "Make sure the rest of the passengers are treated better than I was." She couldn't believe it. She had let such a simple mistake spiral into a public spectacle. And it wasn't just any mistake, it was one made in front of Clint Eastwood, one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Sarah had fumbled, and in doing so, she had invited attention she never wanted. What should have been a routine check-in had turned into a lesson in humility. The crowd, which had been hanging on every word and movement, slowly began to disperse. The murmur of voices faded, and the tension in the air gradually lifted. People went back to their routines, passengers moved toward their gates, and the buzz of the airport resumed. But for Sarah, everything had changed. This wasn't just another day at work for her, it was a turning point. She had learned the hard way that you never truly know who you're dealing with, especially when it came to someone like Clint Eastwood. The man had handled the situation with grace and control, teaching her a lesson she would never forget. And while she'd felt the sting of her mistake, she also understood its value. A small detail, a first-class seat, an overlooked rule, had led to an unforgettable moment that would stay with her for the rest of her career. As Sarah glanced around at the now empty counter, she took a deep breath and tried to shake off the feeling of humiliation. This moment would stay with her, yes, but it would also be a story she would carry forward. She would tell it to friends, colleagues, and maybe even her own children someday, how she made a mistake so simple, so avoidable, but how it became something much bigger, and how it was a reminder that everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. The lesson was clear: pay attention to the details and always show respect. Not just to the customers who seemed ordinary, but to everyone. Everyone, no matter their stature, deserved the same courtesy. The lesson wasn't just about handling a famous celebrity, it was about recognizing the importance of treating people with dignity, no matter what. And Clint Eastwood? Well, for him, this was just another chapter in his legendary career. He didn't need the apology. He didn't need the fanfare. He had simply walked away, his quiet grace and powerful presence leaving behind a mark on Sarah, and everyone who had witnessed the exchange, that would linger long after he had boarded his flight. As Sarah collected herself, she felt a new sense of resolve settle in. She was going to be better. She had to be. And the next time someone stood in front of her, no matter who they were, she would remember this moment, this lesson, and treat them with the same respect she now knew they all deserved.